Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey. Tonight, you and I sit together at the edge of time itself. The fire glows softly, the night stretches wide, and for a little while, the noise of the world can wait outside. Here, history becomes more than names and dates. It becomes a companion, a place you can walk through, slowly, gently, as though you were there. If these calm journeys bring you rest, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep the flame glowing, like a lamp carried through the night. And I would love to know, where are you listening from tonight? What surrounds you? A quiet bedroom, a city that hums even in darkness, or perhaps the open air with stars above. Share it if you wish, so that others may know they are not alone in the night. The night is here, and you are safe. Whatever burdens pressed upon you today, let them slip down now. Let your breath soften. Feel the surface beneath you holding you steady. Let your shoulders fall gently, like curtains closing at dusk. This is your moment, and you need carry nothing more. Tonight, imagine the quiet burn of incense. Its smoke rising in delicate spirals, curling like memory, vanishing as it touches the air. You may almost smell it now. The sweetness of resins, the warmth of woods, the sharpness of herbs. Each fragrance carrying a story, a promise, an unspoken language. In history, scent was never only about pleasure. It was a message. A silent gesture, offered across courts and kingdoms. It was a whisper of peace, a subtle show of power, a greeting made not with words but with the invisible presence of aroma. If your boss gives you a hard time, be glad he is not a pharaoh, demanding frankincense and myrrh at sunrise. In those courts, fragrance was sacred. Refusing it could be seen as rebellion. But here, now, you are free to simply breathe. Free to let the air carry what it will, without duty or demand. The smoke of incense will be your companion tonight. It will brush past you gently. It will remind you that empires have risen and fallen under its veil. It has filled temples, palaces, and halls of power. It has drifted across deserts, seas, and battlefields. And through it all, it has carried meaning. And now, as your eyes grow heavy, as your breath steadies, as the smoke curls quietly into the night sky, we begin. Scent drifts where words cannot go. It moves past walls and curtains, through the folds of fabric, into the deepest corners of memory. It passes through guarded doors, lingers long after voices fade, and clings not only to the air, but to the skin, to the cloth, to the very breath of those who encounter it. Diplomacy has always required symbols. Gestures that speak beyond the reach of language. And while banners could be torn, while coins could be melted, while even letters could be burned, there was another language that endured softly, invisibly. The language of fragrance. Imagine a hall of polished stone, cool beneath the feet of envoys. Torches flicker against walls carved with emblems of power. Musicians tune their instruments, courtiers whisper behind sleeves. Yet before a word is spoken, before a seat is taken, a smoke of resin curls upward from a bronze vessel, rising and weaving its threads through the air. To breathe that air was to be welcomed, to be enveloped, silently, in an atmosphere designed to soothe suspicion and inspire awe. It was, in truth, an invisible handshake. A greeting not of flesh and grip, but of breath and atmosphere. Where the clasp of hands might be stiff, where forced smiles might betray unease, scent was gentler. It slipped beneath pride, it softened the edges of mistrust. It wrapped strangers in the same invisible veil, reminding them that, for this moment at least, they were breathing together. Consider how fragile words can be. A mistranslation, a tone misunderstood, and peace collapses into silence. But scent cannot be mistranslated. Its language is universal, and it bypasses reason entirely. When frankincense drifts into the air, it does not argue, it does not persuade with logic. It simply enters, quietly, deeply, into the part of the mind where memory and feeling are one. In temples, incense carried prayers upward, binding heaven and earth in a scented bridge. Those who entered did not need to read sacred texts or know the rituals in detail. The fragrance itself told them, this place is holy, this moment is set apart. That same idea followed into courts and palaces. When foreign envoys arrived, halls were prepared not only with jewels and food, but with fragrance. It was as if rulers were saying, without words, you are not only seen here, you are felt here, carried into the same sacred breath as us. And when gifts were exchanged, vessels of oil sealed in clay jars, cones of incense wrapped in woven leaves, perfumed cloths folded with care, it was not merely trade. It was a promise. A trust carried on the air. For unlike gold, which could be weighed and hidden, unlike weapons, which could be brandished and feared, fragrance could not be hoarded in secrecy. It had to be experienced, shared in the same moment of breath. That was its quiet brilliance. While jewels declared wealth, fragrance declared intimacy. To give scent was to offer not possession, but presence. It was to allow another to live, however briefly, inside your atmosphere. And that was a gift unlike any other. So imagine the envoy, weary from travel, unsure of what awaits, stepping into a hall where the air itself carries a message. He does not yet know the words of the treaty, he has not yet seen the gifts to be exchanged, but he feels it. He inhales the scented smoke, and already, a softness settles. Already, the walls of suspicion ease, if only a little. This was the hidden current of diplomacy. Not written in treaties, not carved in stone, not even spoken aloud. But always there. Fragrance, the invisible ambassador. Drifting quietly between rulers, softening edges, weaving trust where words alone might falter. And so across centuries, across deserts and seas, across palaces and tents, fragrance remained the silent participant in diplomacy. The unseen guest at every negotiation. The unseen gift at every meeting. The invisible handshake, reminding each side that power need not always be loud. Sometimes, the gentlest breath carries the greatest weight. In the stillness of dawn upon the Nile. The horizon blushed with pale light, and from the temples rose a smoke that carried more than scent. It carried belief. It carried reverence. It carried diplomacy whispered to both gods and men. Egypt's fragrances were not merely pleasant aromas. They were sacred bridges. When frankincense was set alight, its sweetness rose like prayer. When myrrh thickened the air with its deep, resinous breath, it marked not just ritual, but presence. To inhale was to enter into a covenant, not only with the divine, but with those who shared the sacred air beside you. Picture the vast halls of Karnak. Columns taller than forests, their carved faces painted in gold and lapis. A delegation arrives, emissaries from a foreign kingdom, and before they speak, before they kneel, they are welcomed into chambers that glow with incense. The smoke coils around them, the scent enters their lungs. And suddenly they are no longer strangers. They are participants in the same sacred moment. For Egyptians, the offerings of incense were inseparable from statecraft. To gift another ruler a chest of frankincense or a vial of sacred oil was to share in holiness itself. It was to say, "We grant you the breath we give our gods." What greater mark of respect could there be? These gifts traveled far. From the southern lands of Punt, ships arrived heavy with gums, resins, and spices. Exotic fragrances, rare and precious, carried not only to temples but to the palaces of pharaohs. And when emissaries returned home with such treasures, their people inhaled not just scent, but Egypt itself, its authority, its blessing, its mystery lingering in the air. In the great rituals of peace, when enemies laid down their arms, the smoke of incense often drifted between them. It was not the clash of words, nor the writing of terms, but the shared breath of sacred fragrance that sealed the moment. The smoke rose upward, carrying enmity away, and left only the invisible reminder: here, before the gods, both sides were equal. Both sides were human. Even in death, Egypt bound fragrance to diplomacy. The embalming chambers were drenched with resins and myrrh, preserving bodies in perfume so they could cross into eternity. To foreign dignitaries who witnessed such rites, it was a lesson in permanence. Power was not fleeting, it was embalmed, sanctified, perfumed to last beyond time. And so Egypt's fragrances were not only sacred, not only divine. They were tools of persuasion, instruments of alliance. They spoke to gods and rulers alike. They whispered that those who inhaled together, those who shared the same sacred air, were bound in ways stronger than ink and paper. To breathe Egypt's incense was to accept Egypt's presence. To carry home its fragrance was to carry home its authority. And long after the smoke dispersed, the memory lingered. Invisible, but impossible to forget. In the Fertile Crescent, between the slow-moving waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, cities of brick rose like islands in a sea of desert. Towers stepped toward the heavens, ziggurats catching the light of the sun. Market squares echoed with the cries of traders, and the scent of bread, beer, and smoke drifted on the air. Yet hidden among the noise and the stone, another fragrance moved quietly. The fragrance of diplomacy. Perfume, in Mesopotamia, was never only for beauty. It was a tool of power, of closeness, of recognition. A vial of oil carried more weight than a sack of grain, for it was light to carry, rare to find, and impossible to forget. When kings of Akkad, Sumer, or Babylon wished to honor visiting rulers, they did not simply shower them with gold. They placed in their hands vessels of perfume, sealed carefully, their stoppers carved with symbols of lions, bulls, or wings. Imagine the envoy, weary from his long road. He arrives at the gates of Ur, where guards watch from ramparts of baked clay. His feet are sore, his eyes heavy. Yet as he enters the audience hall, a servant approaches with a small alabaster jar. It is unsealed before him, and in an instant, the room changes. A sweet, resinous aroma lifts into the air, mingling with the torch's smoke. The envoy breathes deeply, and the dust of his journey seems to fall away. Perfume was an intimate thing. Unlike gold, which glittered across a hall, unlike silver, which weighed heavy in chests, fragrance required closeness. It had to be touched, poured, applied to the skin. It had to mingle with one's breath. To give perfume was to cross the space between strangers and say, silently, "I allow you to carry my presence upon you." Clay tablets found in the ruins of palaces speak of these gifts. Lists of aromatic oils pressed from cypress, cedar, and juniper. Of blends thickened with resins from Arabia. Of balms made smooth with honey and wine. These tablets are not poetry, yet even in their dry record-keeping, one feels the weight of fragrance. Every jar was more than merchandise, it was memory sealed in clay. The merchants of the Crescent became carriers of more than goods. Their caravans wound across deserts with jars of scented oil tied in woven cloth. At every stop, in Mari, in Nineveh, in Babylon, these jars passed from hand to hand. And each time a stopper was broken, the air filled with diplomacy. One could not buy such a fragrance without also carrying its associations. The reminder of who gave it, of when, of why. Perfume softened the sharp edges of politics. It was often exchanged in moments of fragile peace. Imagine two kings seated across from one another, swords resting outside the chamber, distrust still hanging in the air. A servant steps forward, offering both men oil to anoint their hands. They touch the same jar, smell the same sweetness, and for a brief moment, they are bound not by suspicion but by the same invisible thread of scent. Even war could be eased by fragrance. In the aftermath of sieges, when cities smoldered and treaties trembled in uncertainty, it was not only words that sealed agreements. It was the gesture of perfume, rare, delicate, fleeting. An enemy could take gold and still plot betrayal, but a gift of perfume said something different. It said, "I wish for you to carry me with you, to let me linger on your skin, to remember me not as rival, but as giver." There is something eternal in this act. For perfume, unlike stone or metal, cannot be hoarded in silence. It must be used, must be breathed. It transforms the present moment, and then it fades. And in its fading, it leaves only memory. That was the true brilliance of Mesopotamian diplomacy. They chose gifts that could not be locked away, that could not be counted in weight or stored behind walls. They chose gifts that demanded to be shared. So across the crescent, fragrance became an unspoken envoy. It drifted through palaces, across caravans, into temples. It marked trust between rulers, soothed suspicion between strangers, honored the gods and dignitaries alike. It was invisible, intangible, but powerful. A promise carried on the air. And when the envoys returned home, carrying the fragrance with them on their robes, in their hair, upon their very skin, their people smelled not only perfume. They smelled alliance. They smelled safety. They smelled the invisible threads of peace. Perfume was not a trinket. It was diplomacy distilled. A silent contract written in sweetness, binding those who inhale together in ways that ink and parchment could never equal. In Rome, fragrance flowed not only through temples or palaces, but through the very rhythm of daily life. The empire understood that scent was not merely an ornament of the elite, but a signal of culture itself. To be Roman was to live in a world touched by fragrance, from the steaming baths that welcomed citizens each afternoon, to the perfumed oils that marked festivals, banquets, and diplomatic gatherings. The baths were more than water. They were theaters of power, stages of refinement. Imagine the great thermae of Caracalla, their vaulted ceilings painted with mosaics, their marble floors echoing with footsteps. Pools stretched wide, steam rose in gentle waves, and the air itself was alive with scents. Laurel and pine leaves floated in the warm water. Oils of rose, myrtle, and violet were offered at the entrance. Incense burned in side chambers, perfuming the very walls. Foreign envoys, entering such spaces, could not help but be struck by the atmosphere. Here was not only Rome's wealth on display, but its refinement. Bathing was not a private act, it was a communal ritual, a declaration that cleanliness, beauty, and pleasure were woven into the empire's soul. The air of the baths told visitors, silently, we are not only powerful, we are civilized, we are generous, we are Rome. To the Romans, fragrance was inseparable from diplomacy. The oils poured across the shoulders of visiting dignitaries carried more than aroma, they carried welcome. A consul might pour a drop of spikenard onto the wrist of a guest, rubbing it lightly until its sweetness clung. The guest, breathing it in, would be unable to forget the moment. For fragrance is not fleeting in the mind. It lingers, long after the banquet fades. Perfume shops clustered along the streets of the capital, their jars displayed like jewels. Merchants imported cinnamon from Ceylon, saffron from Spain, frankincense from Arabia, balsam from Judea. Each fragrance, rare and costly, told a story of conquest, of trade, of reach. To offer such perfumes to a foreign guest was to offer the empire itself, distilled into scent. Senators and emperors understood the subtlety of this. A lavish feast might impress the stomach, but a carefully chosen perfume could impress the soul. When Nero scattered saffron water across his theater, drowning the air in sweetness, he was not only pleasing the crowd. He was telling every ambassador present that Rome had command not only over men and armies, but even over the air they breathed. The baths, too, served this purpose. For to invite a foreign emissary into the warm, perfumed waters was to strip away distance. In that shared space, skin glistened, robes were left behind, and scent became the common garment. Differences of language and rank softened under the weight of steam. There, diplomacy could breathe freely, perfumed by oils and herbs that whispered of Rome's abundance. And yet, as with all fragrance, there was fragility. Too much perfume was mocked as decadence. Too little was seen as barbarity. Rome walked a delicate balance, using scent to display its elegance without drowning in excess. The baths themselves embodied this paradox: vast, luxurious, perfumed, yet offered freely to the people. A democracy of scent, masking the hierarchy of power beneath. For visiting dignitaries, the message was clear. Rome did not merely conquer with legions. It conquered with refinement, with culture, with the invisible seduction of fragrance. The baths, with their scented waters and perfumed halls, were silent embassies. Places where Rome spoke without words, where its generosity and its superiority mingled in the same scented steam. And when the envoys left, the fragrance clung. On their skin, in their hair, in their memory. They carried it home, unable to forget the sweetness of Rome. And long after the scent faded, the memory of Rome's power lingered. Not in the clang of swords, not in the weight of treaties, but in the invisible, unforgettable touch of perfume. Across mountains and rivers, beyond deserts where caravans moved like drifting shadows, there stood the Empire of China. An empire that understood fragrance not merely as luxury, but as harmony. A tool that balanced heaven and earth, a silent companion to ritual, order, and diplomacy. In the great halls of the Forbidden City, or in earlier dynasties when palaces rose of timber and tile, foreign emissaries would find themselves enveloped not first by words, but by air. Incense braziers glowed at the entrances, their smoke curling upward like thin, deliberate brushstrokes upon the sky. Sandalwood smoldered softly, its sweetness mingling with the sharp clarity of agarwood. To enter these spaces was to enter not only China's political heart, but its atmosphere. For the Chinese court, incense was not decoration. It was ceremony, it was law, it was rhythm. Officials marked the passing of hours by the slow burn of incense sticks, each segment measured like a clock of smoke. Temples carried it as prayer, and palaces carried it as order. To walk into a chamber where incense burned was to understand. This was a place ruled by harmony, where every detail was attuned to the unseen. Emissaries from distant lands, Mongols, Persians, Koreans, even Romans in whispered stories, would bow in chambers where incense hung thick. They might not understand the language, they might stumble over the words of ritual, but they understood the scent. It soothed, it humbled, it reminded them that they stood in a space larger than themselves. Gifts of incense and fragrant woods were exchanged as treasures. Agarwood from the south, sandalwood carried from India, rare blends that traveled along winding routes into the emperor's hands. To present such a gift was to show respect for China's refinement, to honor the idea that fragrance was not frivolous, but sacred. Diplomacy often unfolded in these scented halls, softened by the air itself. Imagine two delegations seated across lacquered tables, scrolls unfurled, words formal and stiff. Between them, a bronze burner releases a steady ribbon of smoke. It coils upward, twining between voices, carrying with it calm. Breaths deepen, tones soften. The air itself urges patience, reminding each side that peace is possible when harmony is shared. The rituals of incense were not only about welcome, they were about power. For to control the atmosphere of a room is to control the mood of its guests. An envoy might enter tense, suspicious, burdened by fear. Yet after an hour within perfumed air, shoulders loosen, expressions ease. The Emperor's message is clear, though unspoken: we have shaped the air you breathe. We have already surrounded you. We can bring peace or pressure without a single word. Even in private, the scholar gentry practiced this diplomacy. A host would light incense before a guest arrived, filling the chamber with quiet sweetness. The guest, stepping in, knew at once: I am honored, I am respected, I am received with care. No declaration was needed. The smoke said everything. The fragrance lingered long after envoys departed. Woven into their robes, carried back to their homelands. And when they spoke of China, they did not only recall its palaces or its power. They recalled the air itself. Fragrant, deliberate, timeless. An atmosphere that told them they had stood in the presence of a civilization older and greater than their own. Thus, in China, incense was diplomacy. It was the veil through which outsiders were welcomed, the atmosphere in which treaties were born, the invisible reminder that harmony was as powerful as armies. And though the smoke always rose, always disappeared, the memory of its sweetness endured, binding strangers to China's influence long after the embers cooled. The Silk Road was never only silk. It was never only jewels or horses or scrolls. It was an artery of scent. A path where caravans carried not just goods, but atmospheres. Where the air of one land mingled with the breath of another. Picture it. A long caravan winding across the Taklamakan desert. Camels bending under their loads, their bells chiming softly in the wind. Bales of silk are tied in neat bundles, jars of glass glint in the sun, and among them are hidden treasures more delicate than any: sacks of cinnamon, cones of frankincense, sealed jars of myrrh, sandalwood carved into blocks, attas pressed from rose and jasmine. The desert itself holds no fragrance, only the smell of dust and leather. But within these bundles lie the scents of distant kingdoms, waiting to be released. When these caravans arrived at trading posts, Samarkand, Kasha, Bukhara, the air would shift as merchants unwrapped their wares. A small chip of agarwood placed on a coal could transform an entire hall, filling it with sweetness that spoke of India's forests. A handful of cloves could perfume a pot of wine, filling it with the sharp breath of distant islands. These were not mere luxuries, they were invitations. Proof that one land could carry the atmosphere of another across deserts and mountains. Scent along the Silk Road was more than trade. It was alliance. When rulers exchanged sandalwood or rose oil, they were not only buying perfume, they were weaving bonds. To gift a block of rare wood was to say, our breath may mingle with yours, our lives may overlap, our paths may intertwine. Envoys carried fragrance like messages. Imagine a delegation from Persia arriving in Chang'an during the Tang dynasty. They bring bolts of silk, yes, and vessels of silver, but their most cherished gift is resin from the Arabian Peninsula. In the Chinese court, it is received not only with gratitude but with reverence. Burned in the imperial burners, it softens the room, and the emperor nods, not at the silver, not at the silk, but at the smoke rising in quiet grace. So too did caravans carry eastward the scents of China. Pouches of musk, carefully gathered from the mountains, traveled to Persia and beyond. Lotus oil, distilled with patience, reached India, where it mixed with native sandalwood to create perfumes never before known. The Silk Road was not only an exchange of goods, but of atmospheres, of breaths, of invisible ambassadors that traveled farther than armies ever could. Think of the merchant, resting at night by a desert fire. He opens a small jar, dips a cloth into perfumed oil, and lets it linger in the air. Around him sit strangers, some from Arabia, some from India, some from far-off China. They speak different tongues, they trade in different coins. But for a moment, they all breathe the same fragrance. And in that breath, trust is born. This was the quiet genius of the Silk Road. Weapons were not its strength. Armies could guard it for a time, but they could not carry it forward. What bound east to west was something softer. The allure of fragrance. The way a single vial of oil could carry with it the promise of distant lands, the presence of absent kings, the memory of meetings far away. In this way, the Silk Road became a perfumed corridor. Not marked only by the dust of wheels or the footprints of camels, but by the invisible trails of smoke and oil and spice. Fragrance turned strangers into allies, merchants into envoys, and deserts into bridges. And though the jars emptied, though the wood was burned, though the oils were spent, the memory remained. Diplomacy along the Silk Road was not written only in treaties, but in the way a scent lingered in the mind, reminding one people of another long after their caravan had disappeared into the horizon. In India, fragrance was woven into life like thread through fabric. Not only in temples, not only in homes, but in the courts of kings, where sandalwood, soft and sacred, spoke a language older than conquest, older than treaties, older even than kingdoms themselves. Imagine the royal court of an Indian king. Carved pillars rising high, their surfaces painted with lotus and elephant, their shadows stretching long across marble floors. Courtiers stand in silence, waiting. Then attendants step forward with bowls of sandalwood paste, cool and golden against the skin. With practiced hands, they mark the brows of visiting envoys, a gentle touch, a fragrant blessing. And before any words of diplomacy are spoken, the message is already clear. You are honored, you are protected, you are within the circle of respect. Sandalwood carried weight beyond its sweetness. Its smoke was believed to calm the mind, to steady the heart, to invite truth. To gift it was to offer not only luxury, but virtue. To smear it upon the skin was to bring coolness to the body, clarity to the spirit. In Indian courts, sandalwood was both gift and guardian. Foreign emissaries often arrived bearing treasures, gold from the West, horses from Central Asia, silks from China. Yet when sandalwood was offered in return, its value was not measured in weight but in meaning. For sandalwood spoke of India's forests, its rivers, its sacred rituals. It was a piece of the land itself, carried across borders as a sign of goodwill. Consider the perfumed oils, the attar distilled with rose and jasmine, blended carefully with sandalwood's deep base. These attars were jewels in liquid form. A ruler might send a vial of such fragrance to another king far away, knowing that the scent would linger on his hands, on his clothes, in his chambers. Each time he breathed it, he would remember the giver. Memory itself was scented, tied to diplomacy. Stories tell of treaties sealed not with ink, but with fragrance. A chest of sandalwood logs presented at the close of negotiations. Anointing oils gifted to a rival court to mark the end of enmity. Even marriages between kingdoms were perfumed, the bridal chamber prepared with garlands of jasmine and bowls of sandalwood paste. In these moments, fragrance was not an ornament, it was the bond itself. The courtiers knew this well. They burned sandalwood during audiences, filling the halls with a sweetness that softened tempers. They prepared garlands soaked in its essence to drape upon ambassadors. And when disputes threatened to flare, sandalwood was brought forth, to remind all present that calmness was possible, that peace was the greater fragrance. It is said that sandalwood perfumes the axe that cuts it. Such was its nature, to give sweetness even in destruction. And so in diplomacy, it became the perfect symbol. Even in conflict, sandalwood promised reconciliation. Even in rivalry, it whispered of respect. For the kings of India, sandalwood was more than a gift. It was a statement of civilization. A reminder that power was not only shown in armies or fortresses, but in the fragrance that lingered long after the envoy departed. And so envoys returned home, carrying with them the perfume of India. Upon their robes, in their satchels, in their memory. They may have forgotten the exact words spoken in the court, but they did not forget the fragrance. That sweetness lived on, invisible yet enduring, a bond of trust carried on the breath of sandalwood. Far from the incense of temples and the sandalwood of Indian courts, another stage of fragrance rose upon the waters of Europe. Venice, the city of canals, the bride of the Adriatic, the meeting place of East and West. Here, perfume was not only luxury, not only pleasure. It was strategy, it was leverage, it was power distilled into scent. Picture the great Venetian markets. Narrow alleys opening suddenly into wide squares, stalls crowded with glass jars glowing like captured sunlight. Merchants called out in a dozen tongues, bargaining over silk, spices, jewels. And always, among them, fragrance. Perfumes arriving from Damascus, resins carried from Arabia, musk brought from Tibet, ambergris washed up from distant seas. Venice gathered them all, stored them in her warehouses, bottled them in her glass, and sold them onward to Europe's kings. Perfume in Venice was currency. To control its trade was to control desire itself. For while silk clothed the body, perfume clothed the air, the spirit, the memory. And so Venetian merchants became not only traders but diplomats, their ships carrying fragrances that softened alliances, soothed rivalries, sealed marriages across kingdoms. Envoys who came to Venice often found their negotiations scented. A council chamber where sandalwood smoke drifted quietly through carved beams. A banquet where wine was spiced with cinnamon and cloves, their aroma rising before the taste touched the tongue. And when treaties were signed, gifts were exchanged not only in coin, but in perfume bottles, delicate works of Murano glass, filled with oils as rare as any gem. The power of Venice lay in its position. Between the east that produced fragrance and the west that craved it. The city became the mediator, the filter, the gatekeeper. And fragrance, invisible though it was, became a weapon in its diplomacy. When Venice favored one ally with access to rare perfumes, and denied another, the difference was felt not only in wealth, but in pride. A court without fragrance was a court diminished. Consider the ambassadors who returned to France, to Spain, to the Holy Roman Empire. They carried perfumes in glass vials, gifts sealed with Venetian wax. When they uncorked them in their distant courts, the air of Venice spread outward. Not only the scent itself, but the message. This came from Venice, this passed through her hands, this city is the center through which the world must move. And so the city mastered a subtle art. It did not conquer with armies, it conquered with trade, with culture, with fragrance. The canals were its walls, the markets its battlegrounds, the perfumes its soldiers. And with every vial exchanged, every fragrance carried across the Alps, Venice extended its reach into the courts of Europe. Perfume was its silent ally. Unseen, unmeasured, yet present in every negotiation, every treaty, every marriage contract scented with oils born in the East, bottled in Venice, breathed in Paris or Vienna. In this way, Venice held power that was invisible but undeniable. The merchants knew it, the rulers knew it, and the diplomats who passed through her markets knew it most of all. For long after their ships sailed, long after their voices faded, the fragrance lingered, carrying with it the name of Venice. In the vast empire of the Ottomans, where mosques rose with domes like inverted heavens and palaces stretched with marble courtyards and tiled walls, diplomacy was never only about words. It was ritual. It was atmosphere. And among the most gentle, the most symbolic of these rituals, was the offering of rosewater. Imagine the divan, the imperial council chamber in Istanbul. Sunlight filters through latticed windows, softening as it falls upon silken cushions and carpets thick with woven stories. The air is hushed. Envoys from distant lands wait nervously, their petitions sealed in scrolls, their eyes wary of the grandeur around them. Then, before the viziers enter, attendants step forward. They carry delicate ewers of silver, filled with rosewater. They pour it into shallow basins, inviting each guest to wash their hands, to let the fragrance rise. Coolness touches the skin, sweetness drifts upward. And in that single act, the room changes. Rosewater was purity. It cleansed not only the body, but the space between people. To anoint oneself with it before speaking was to declare, "I come with clean hands, I come with respect, I come in peace." The Ottomans understood this deeply. They knew that fragrance softened suspicion, that the ritual of washing could erase the residue of enmity, if only for a while. When peace treaties were signed, rosewater often sealed the moment. Basins were passed around the table, each delegate dipping their fingers, touching their brows, inhaling the cool perfume. The treaty was written on parchment, yes, but it was carried in the fragrance too. Invisible, unforgettable. The scent lingered longer than the ink. Rosewater fountains flowed in palace courtyards. Their waters bubbled softly, scattering droplets that caught the light. Visitors would pause, cup their hands, breathe in the sweetness. A reminder that here, in this empire of many tongues and many lands, fragrance was a common language. Gifts of rosewater traveled across borders. Carried in gilded flasks to the courts of Europe, to Persia, to the Mughal palaces of India. To receive it was to receive not only a luxury, but a blessing. A whisper from Istanbul that peace was possible, that enmity could be washed away like dust. Consider the envoy returning home, his satchel heavy with documents and gifts. Yet it is the rosewater he remembers most. The way it cooled his palms, the way its sweetness clung to his robes. In the nights that followed, when the fragrance rose faintly from the cloth, he would recall not only the words spoken in the council chamber, but the feeling of welcome, of respect, of calm. For rosewater was more than ritual. It was diplomacy distilled. It said, silently but surely, "We honor you, we forgive, we begin anew." In its sweetness was strength, in its purity was power. And though the bowls emptied, though the basins dried, the fragrance lingered, carrying its message far beyond the palace walls. The Ottomans knew this truth. That power could be declared in armies, in architecture, in gold. But it could also be declared in something softer. In the cool sweetness of rosewater, poured into waiting hands, rising invisibly into the air. Reminding all who breathed it that peace, too, had its fragrance. In 16th century France, fragrance left the temples, the markets, the caravans, and entered into intrigue. For in the hands of Catherine de' Medici, the Italian queen who crossed the Alps to marry into the French throne, perfume became more than beauty, more than welcome. It became weapon, whisper, signal, code. Picture the French court of Catherine's time. Grand halls hung with tapestries, heavy with velvet and brocade, alive with whispers of ambition. Nobles circled like hawks, each move measured, each smile sharpened. And within this world of endless rivalry, Catherine carried with her something new. A Florentine perfumer, Renato Bianco, later known as René Le Florentine. He arrived with her from Italy, his skills unmatched, his vials filled with secrets. Perfumes filled her court, not scattered carelessly, not poured in excess, but chosen carefully, woven with purpose. For Catherine understood what few rulers before her had grasped. That fragrance could be message. That scent could move silently through a hall, touching one person and not another. She gifted perfumes as tokens of loyalty. a vial to a favored courtier, a sachet sewn into the garments of a trusted ally. To wear her fragrance was to signal one's closeness to the queen, one's place within her inner circle. The air itself became a map of allegiance. But the perfumes did more. Some whispered that Catherine's perfumes carried more than flowers. That in them, poisons might be hidden. That a glove perfumed with sweet oils might also burn the skin, weaken the breath, steal the life of an enemy while leaving behind only sweetness. Whether rumor or truth, the idea spread, and with it Catherine's power grew. For in diplomacy, fear itself is a kind of fragrance. Invisible, clinging, impossible to dispel. She also used perfume as persuasion. When ambassadors from foreign lands arrived, she received them in chambers laced with scents of orange blossom, jasmine, and musk. The atmosphere was softened, the words of negotiation drifted in air already sweetened, already influenced. Scent turned rigid formality into velvet ease, suspicion into something nearer to trust. At her festivals, the court was drowned in fragrance. Fountains that spouted rosewater, gloves, and fans infused with violet oils, clothing stitched with sachets of herbs. To stand in her presence was to be enveloped in perfume. It was not ornament, it was theatre. Diplomacy performed not only in words and treaties, but in the very air her guests were forced to breathe. And beneath it all lay secrecy. A perfumed fan could carry not only a breeze, but a coded message. A glove scented in a certain way could signal allegiance or betrayal. For Catherine's court was one of endless plots, and fragrance was her invisible ink. She did not conquer like Rome, nor trade like Venice, nor bless like the Ottomans. She whispered through perfume. A drop on the wrist, a cloud in a chamber, a sachet sewn into a gown. And the currents of power shifted. Unseen, but felt. And long after the perfumes faded, long after the vials emptied, her legend remained. Catherine de Medici, Queen of France, mistress of fragrance. Who turned perfume into politics, who proved that diplomacy does not always march in armies or ride in carriages. Sometimes it drifts, silent and unseen, upon the air. If Catherine de Medici made perfume a weapon of influence, it was at Versailles that fragrance became a kingdom of its own. For under Louis XIV, the Sun King, scent was not an ornament of the court, it was the atmosphere of the court. A cloud in which power lived, moved, and displayed itself. Versailles shimmered with gold and mirrors, but beneath its brilliance, the truth was less radiant. The air was heavy, crowded with thousands of courtiers, soldiers, servants, dancers, petitioners. Bathing was rare, sanitation uneven. And so the court turned to perfume, drowning itself in fragrance to cover what could not be concealed. Imagine the Hall of Mirrors at dusk. Chandeliers glittering with candlelight, velvet gowns brushing the marble floors, wigs powdered and towering. Courtiers glide, whisper, bow. And with every step, with every movement of silk and brocade, perfumes rise. Ambergris clinging to collars, musk soaked into gloves, jasmine oils pressed into handkerchiefs, rosewater sprinkled upon lace. The air itself grows thick, a living tapestry of scents that mix and clash. For the nobility of Versailles, perfume was not only necessity, it was hierarchy. To wear a fragrance too plain was to risk ridicule, to wear one too rare was to declare ambition. Each vial signaled status, each blend whispered alliances. When a courtier leaned in to kiss a hand, it was not only words exchanged, but fragrance. A silent measure of rank, of wealth, of favor. Louis XIV himself adored orange blossom. His personal perfumer created fountains of scented water, pavilions heavy with aroma, garments laced with sachets. The king's very presence was perfumed, and to breathe near him was to inhale his chosen sweetness. It was said that when he walked through Versailles, one could follow his path by fragrance alone. Diplomacy at Versailles unfolded in this scented haze. Ambassadors arrived from distant lands, Persia, Siam, the Ottoman Empire, and found themselves enveloped in air so perfumed it was overwhelming. They marveled, they stumbled, they carried the memory home. Versailles was not simply a palace, it was a scented theatre of power, designed to intoxicate. But beneath the beauty lay intrigue. For scent, as at Catherine's court, could carry secrets. A perfumed glove might whisper loyalty, a sachet of herbs might signal affection, a vial gifted in confidence might carry a hidden message. Rumors spread of nobles poisoned by perfumed letters, of rivals undone by oils too sweet, too strange. Whether true or not, the whispers gave fragrance another layer of power, fear. To move in Versailles was to move in scent. Every corridor, every chamber, every gathering saturated with invisible signals. Diplomacy here was not shouted, not signed only on paper, but breathed. In the press of perfumes that lingered long after a meeting ended. And when foreign envoys departed, they carried not only treaties, not only impressions of gold and mirrors. They carried the air itself in memory. An atmosphere thick with intrigue, beauty, and excess. Versailles lived in their minds as a place where fragrance ruled as surely as the king. Perfume at Versailles was not merely indulgence. It was theatre, hierarchy, manipulation, diplomacy. Invisible threads binding 1,000 ambitions, masking decay with sweetness, covering intrigue with roses. It was Versailles itself, beautiful, intoxicating, fragile. A world where scent was power, and power was scent. Far across the seas, in Japan, fragrance was not drowned in excess as it was in Versailles. It was refined, disciplined, made into art. A path of listening rather than drowning. And in that refinement, it became another tool of diplomacy, subtle and profound. The Japanese called it KD, the way of incense. Not simply the burning of fragrance, but the listening to it. For to practice KD was to quiet oneself, to attend with patience to the smoke rising from rare woods, to notice its hidden notes, its whispers. It was not the loud declaration of power, but the silent cultivation of harmony. Imagine a quiet chamber in Kyoto, its floors of tatami straw, its walls sliding open to a garden of still stones and raked sand. A brazier glows softly, and within it rests a fragment of aloeswood, dark and glistening, rare as a jewel. As the ember touches it, the wood releases its breath, faint, delicate, lingering. The participants sit in silence, leaning forward to breathe, not merely to smell, but to listen. Foreign envoys, invited to such ceremonies, often found themselves bewildered. In other courts, power was loud, marked by armies, treasures, abundance. Here, it was the opposite. A splinter of wood, small enough to fit in a palm, became the centerpiece of an audience. Its fragrance carried more meaning than words. To partake in KD was to be accepted, to be honored with refinement itself. The ceremony was also a game. Incense guessing contests, where guests closed their eyes and identified the woods, compared the scents to poems, to landscapes, to memories. But it was never frivolous. It was training, a lesson that attention itself is power. For a guest who listened well to incense was a guest who could listen well to diplomacy. The shoguns and emperors knew this. Incense ceremonies were stages where alliances could be tested. A rival might be invited to sit in stillness, to share breath with the host, to inhale the same rare fragrance. And in that shared silence, tension softened. Enmity dissolved into attention. The invisible air between them was transformed into common ground. Fragrance, in this form, became a mirror of Japanese aesthetics. The art of impermanence, the beauty of the fleeting. The incense smoke rose, lingered, and vanished, just as treaties rose and fell, just as peace was fragile. The lesson was written in the air itself. That power, like fragrance, endures only as memory. And yet, what memory? For those who returned from Japan often carried tales not of armies or walls, but of refinement, of incense ceremonies where silence spoke louder than words. Diplomacy scented with aloeswood and sandalwood, with an elegance so rare that it left an imprint stronger than conquest. In KD, fragrance was not only culture. It was diplomacy distilled into art. A way of showing outsiders that power need not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, like a thin trail of smoke, curling gently upward, vanishing into the air. Not every fragrance in history soothed. Not every plume of smoke invited peace. For as long as rulers understood that scent could calm, they also knew it could disturb. Fragrance, like power itself, could be turned to darker purposes. It could unsettle, suffocate, overwhelm. And in times of war, scent became another weapon, drifting invisibly upon the air. Imagine a battlefield at dawn. The ground still damp with dew, the sky painted in pale grey. Soldiers stand ready, tense, their hearts thundering louder than the drums. And then, before the first arrows fly, the enemy sends forth smoke. Not the sweet fragrance of incense, but herbs burned to stifle breath. Acrid fumes that sting the eyes, clog the lungs, blur the mind. Already, before blades clash, the body is unbalanced. In ancient sieges, defenders sometimes hurled burning pots filled with foul-smelling mixtures over city walls. Sulfur, pitch, even rotting matter. The stench alone could drive back attackers, unsettling their courage, breaking their focus. Fragrance in this form was no gift. It was reminder. We will choke you, we will smother you, we will let the air itself turn against you. Even in ritual, fragrance was used to intimidate. Armies marching into battle burned thick smokes of herbs and resins, not only as offerings to their gods, but to overwhelm their enemies. Clouds of pungent aroma rolled across the field, blurring vision, carrying with them an unspoken threat that even the air belonged to those who commanded it. The Mongols were said to burn noxious substances in their war camps, creating barriers of choking smoke that enemies feared to approach. In medieval Europe, invading armies sometimes poisoned wells with foul-smelling herbs, not only to sicken those who drank, but to let the stench itself carry dread. For to breathe corruption was to breathe fear. And yet, scent could be weaponized not only against the body, but against the mind. Consider the psychological warfare of burning villages, fields, and homes. The smoke of destruction was itself a weapon. It carried despair upon the wind. An enemy did not need to see the flames. To smell the acrid char was enough to know that loss had already come. Even sacred incense could be turned toward intimidation. A ruler might flood a hall with an overwhelming fragrance during an audience with envoys, using scent not to welcome, but to dominate. What should have soothed instead suffocated, reminding the visitor that hospitality could shift into threat without a word spoken. War has always sought to control the senses. The clash of sound, the blinding of sight, the breaking of touch. And scent was no different. Whether through foul smoke to choke, or overwhelming fragrance to unsettle, rulers knew that power over the air was power over the spirit. And when the battles ended, the memory of war was not only in scars, not only in ruins. It lingered in the air itself. In the smell of ash, of blood, of burned wood, of smoke drifting endlessly into the horizon. That too was diplomacy, though of the harshest kind. A warning carried on the wind, invisible yet undeniable. For fragrance, in war, was no longer the gift of trust. It was the ghost of destruction. The reminder that peace, fragile and sweet, could at any moment be broken, replaced by smoke that stung the eyes, darkened the sky, and carried only the memory of fear. After the smoke of war has drifted away, after the clash of steel has fallen silent, after the fields have cooled from fire, there comes another fragrance. Softer, slower, more fragile. The scent of peace. Imagine two armies once locked in battle. Their banners torn, their men weary, their leaders burdened by the memory of loss. The battlefield still holds the stench of ash, of sweat, of fear. And then, in the hush that follows surrender, a new smoke begins to rise. Not acrid, not choking, but sweet. Frankincense drifting upward, sandalwood glowing, herbs burning gently. The air shifts. It is no longer the atmosphere of war. It is the breath of reconciliation. Throughout history, fragrance has marked not only conflict but its ending. In temples across Mesopotamia, incense was offered after treaties, its smoke carrying prayers for harmony. In Egypt, resins once burned for gods were lit again to seal pacts between rulers. The Ottomans washed their hands with rosewater at the signing of peace, as if to cleanse the memory of blood. In India, sandalwood paste was shared between rivals, its cooling touch declaring that heat had passed, that anger was set aside. These moments mattered because scent is memory. Words fade, documents can be broken, but the fragrance of peace imprints itself upon the mind. An enemy who once breathed smoke that stung now breathes sweetness that soothes. The body remembers. The spirit cannot forget. Picture a hall of reconciliation. Envoys seated across from one another, the ink of their signatures still drying on parchment. Between them, a brazier glows, sending forth threads of cedar and myrrh. Both sides inhale, both sides fall silent. And in that silence, the fragrance speaks, "This is over. This is new." You are bound not only by words, but by the air you now share. In villages too, peace was perfumed. After raids ended, after borders shifted, people gathered around fires where herbs were burned not to repel but to welcome. Women sprinkled rosewater in the streets, priests swung censers heavy with incense, garlands of flowers scented the air. Peace was not only declared, it was breathed. Fragrance carried forgiveness better than language. For language could be sharp, it could reopen wounds, it could stumble over pride. But scent slipped past resistance. It touched the old memory of calm, of hearth, of sanctuary. It whispered that life could begin again, that the bitterness of smoke could be replaced by sweetness. And so the scent of peace became a pattern, repeated across cultures. The burning of incense in Asia after treaties. The sprinkling of rosewater in Ottoman courts. The gift of perfumed oils in Indian palaces. The exchange of scented gloves in European halls. Each one different, each one the same. Fragrance as the marker that war was behind, that peace was ahead. The air itself seemed to change in such moments. What had been heavy with the smell of fire became light with sweetness. What had been haunted by blood became softened with flowers. And those who breathed it, whether kings or commoners, felt their shoulders ease, their hearts loosen. Peace was never permanent. It was as fragile as fragrance itself. It drifted, it vanished, it could be lost to the next wind. But while it lasted, it held a power greater than weapons. For to breathe the scent of peace was to remember what could be, even in a world of conflict. And long after the incense burned out, long after the flowers wilted, the memory endured. The memory of a moment when the air itself carried forgiveness. The memory of peace made real not in words, but in fragrance. When peace could no longer be carried by incense alone, when treaties were broken and alliances shifted with the tide, fragrance found itself bound to another force, empire. For in the age of exploration, in the centuries when European ships found across oceans, scent was no longer only a ritual of diplomacy. It was the very prize of conquest. The fragrance of cinnamon, of clove, of nutmeg, of pepper. Treasures so light, yet more valuable than gold. Imagine the wooden decks of a Portuguese carrack, its sails full, its hull heavy with crates. Inside, among bolts of cloth and bars of silver, are sacks of spices. Their scent escapes even through the cracks, cinnamon sweet and sharp, cloves pungent and warm, nutmeg rich with mystery. The sailors breathe it day after day, and when they return to Lisbon, the docks themselves are perfumed. The air tells the city before the bells do, the ships have returned. It was not only wealth. It was diplomacy rewritten. Kings sent envoys to the East Indies not only with letters of alliance, but with orders to seize. Dutch merchants built forts on islands where nutmeg trees grew, declaring ownership not just of land but of air. For once Europe tasted and breathed these fragrances, it could not let them go. Diplomacy bent beneath hunger, and fragrance became the law that pulled continents into conflict. Colonial powers raced for monopoly. The Portuguese in Malacca, the Dutch in the Moluccas, the English in India. Each sought to control the invisible empire of scent. For he who owned the cinnamon trade controlled the kitchens of kings. He who held the nutmeg islands controlled the feasts of Europe. And in the parlors of Paris, in the banquets of Madrid, in the drawing rooms of London, the perfumes of distant forests became symbols of prestige. But scent was not only commerce, it was diplomacy disguised. Treaties were drawn not in temples but on ships, signed not with incense smoke but with contracts of spice. Local rulers were courted with gifts of perfumes, promised wealth in exchange for ports, for loyalty, for control. Yet beneath the sweetness lay ambition, and fragrance became a tether pulling nations into empires they did not choose. Imagine the court of a sultan in the Spice Islands. European envoys bowing low, presenting chests filled with Venetian glass vials, each holding oils perfumed with rose, musk, amber. The sultan nods politely, accepts the gifts. But he knows the true fragrance in the air is not the rosewater they pour upon his hands. It is the cloves growing on his own hills, the nutmeg trees swaying in his own winds. And he knows that those scents, more than armies, have brought these strangers to his shores. Colonial trade turned fragrance into empire. It was the invisible thread that stitched oceans together, sometimes with diplomacy, often with force. It carried perfumes to Europe and muskets to Asia. It brought rosewater to Versailles and war to the Moluccas. It spread sandalwood to London and took sovereignty from its forests. And yet, even in this, fragrance retained its double edge. It was both gift and chain, both welcome and warning. Colonizers brought scented oils to impress rulers, but those rulers also used fragrance to test them. To share incense was to measure trust, to see if sweetness could outweigh suspicion. For even under the shadow of conquest, diplomacy still breathed in fragrance. The air of empire was perfumed, but its sweetness was laced with struggle. Cinnamon carried the memory of blood, nutmeg the scent of fire, cloves the breath of battles fought far from European shores. And yet, in every court, in every treaty, fragrance remained. Carried in gifts, exchanged in rituals, its invisible presence lingering long after ships sailed and borders shifted. Colonial trade proved that fragrance was no longer just a whisper between rulers. It was a force that shaped the world. An invisible empire, drifting on the winds, carried in the holds of ships, binding continents in bonds both fragile and fierce. Though the great empires of spice and incense have faded into memory, though the caravans no longer cross deserts with jars of myrrh, and the Venetian galleys no longer guard the channels of clove and cinnamon, fragrance has not left diplomacy. It lingers still, softer now, yet present, a quiet companion in the halls of modern power. Picture a state visit. The flash of cameras, the red carpet unrolled, the hands clasped in public greeting. And then, away from the noise, in the quiet of a gilded room, a gift is presented. Not only medals or documents, but perfumes, oils, rare atars, bottles sealed with care. For even now, leaders know that scent carries a message words cannot. When the French president gifts a vial of perfume crafted in grass, he is offering more than a fragrance. He is offering France itself, its heritage, its artistry, its identity distilled into liquid. When a Middle Eastern ruler offers a visitor oud, that dark and precious resin, it is not only generosity. It is a sharing of tradition, a reminder that the guest now carries with him the air of another land. Consider the Vatican, where incense still curls in chambers where envoys gather. Or Japan, where a rare box of aloeswood might be exchanged in ceremonies of honor. Or India, where rose atars are pressed into the hands of visiting dignitaries. These gestures, though quieter than the treaties signed, linger longer. For when the scent rises, it cannot be ignored. Even in the modern age of steel and glass, where summits unfold beneath electric lights and treaties are typed on glowing screens, fragrance is present. Not shouted, not displayed, but offered with deliberate care. The bottle of perfume in a velvet box, the garland of jasmine at an airport welcome, the incense lit before a diplomatic banquet. Each says, without words, "We honor you, we welcome you, we wish this meeting to linger like fragrance itself." Perfume has also become symbol in subtler ways. When Queen Elizabeth II received atars of rose and sandalwood from Indian leaders, the gesture was more than courtesy, it was an echo of centuries of shared, and often troubled, history. When Middle Eastern monarchs gift perfumes to Western leaders, they offer not only bottles, but access to heritage, to culture, to values distilled. In these exchanges, fragrance is not luxury alone. It is memory, it is atmosphere, it is diplomacy itself made tangible in the air. For unlike jewels or art, perfumes cannot be locked away untouched. They must be opened, inhaled, experienced. They transform the room when released, just as diplomacy transforms relations when trust is offered. And so, in the 21st century, fragrance continues its old role. Invisible, fragile, fleeting, yet powerful. It may no longer command empires or redraw maps, but it still shapes impressions, softens encounters, opens doors. For when a leader returns home and the scent of rose, oud, or lavender clings to his robes, his memory is marked. Not by the weight of speeches, but by the sweetness of air. And long after the bottles are emptied, long after the garlands are dry, the gesture remains. Fragrance endures as it always has, a silent envoy, drifting softly across centuries, carrying its message without a single word. In our own age, where treaties are signed in glass towers, where delegates sit at long polished tables beneath fluorescent lights, the ancient truth of fragrance has not been forgotten. For even in these modern rooms of power, scent shapes the air. It influences the rhythm of voices, the tension of shoulders, the mood of minds. Imagine a negotiation room before talks begin. The air is still, the table bare, the silence heavy. Then, almost unnoticed, a diffuser hums quietly in the corner. A light fragrance of lavender drifts outward. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just enough to soften the edges of restlessness. One delegate, who arrived with clenched jaw and quick breath, feels his shoulders ease. Another, who feared hostility, inhales and feels a measure of calm. The room has changed, though no words have yet been spoken. Psychologists know what ancient rulers sensed intuitively. That scent bypasses reason. It touches memory, emotion, instinct. A note of citrus brightens alertness, sharpening thought. A thread of sandalwood grounds, steadying nerves. A hint of peppermint awakens, pushing back fatigue during long hours of debate. These aromas are not spoken of in the minutes of meetings, but they shape the meetings nonetheless. In some cases, the choice is deliberate. A diplomat may choose to meet in a chamber scented faintly of jasmine, creating an atmosphere of welcome. Another may burn subtle incense, invoking tradition, reminding guests of heritage and continuity. Some may even avoid fragrance altogether, knowing that neutrality itself can be a signal. For even absence is a choice. Consider the United Nations headquarters. Delegates gather from across the world, each carrying unspoken memories of home. A faint fragrance in the air can awaken those memories, a whiff of cedar reminding one of mountains, of resilience. A trace of rose reminding another of ceremonies, of honor. And though the talks may stall, though the words may clash, the air itself offers a quiet undercurrent, whispering that common ground is still possible. Businesses, too, have borrowed this ancient diplomacy. Boardrooms scented with soft vanilla or bergamot ease the signing of contracts. Conferences employ diffused aromas to encourage patience among global investors. And though these may seem like tricks of commerce, they are in truth echoes of older rituals: the invisible handshake, the scented hall, the perfumed treaty. For the human mind has not changed. The pathways of scent still lead to memory, still bypass argument, still settle where reason cannot. And so negotiators, knowingly or not, still work within the old currents. The air they breathe together is as much a part of diplomacy as the words they speak. When the talks end, when pens are set down, when the delegates file out, the room falls quiet again. Yet the fragrance lingers. On the fabric of a suit, in the memory of a breath. And perhaps, later, when one wakes in a distant hotel room and inhales the faint trace upon a collar, he remembers not only the struggle of negotiation, but the calm of that moment when the air itself whispered peace. So it has always been. So it continues. Fragrance, unseen, unmeasured, shaping the currents of decision. The same breath that once drifted through temples and palaces now hums through boardrooms and parliaments. reminding us that diplomacy is not only written in treaties, but breathed in silence. Long before words are learned, before reason sharpens its edges, before memory begins to write in images, there is scent. It is the oldest of the senses, older than sight, older than speech. It slips past the walls of logic, it bypasses argument, it roots itself deep in the hidden chambers of the brain. And because of this, it has always been a secret tool of diplomacy. When a child is born, it does not first recognize the world by sight. It knows its mother by her scent. When soldiers march into battle, the memory of home lingers not in images, but in fragrance, bread, fields, fire. When an envoy enters a court perfumed with incense, he may not understand the words spoken, but he cannot resist the message carried through the air. Scientists now explain what the ancients already practiced. The pathways of scent travel directly to the limbic system, the seat of memory, of fear, of comfort. A single fragrance can awaken years long forgotten. A touch of sandalwood can bring calm. A whiff of rose can stir love. A breath of smoke can summon dread. And in that instant, the body responds before the mind can reason. Diplomats of old may not have known the science, but they knew the effect. They knew that an envoy soothed by fragrance was an envoy softened for persuasion. They knew that peace sealed in incense lingered longer than peace written only on parchment. They knew that power was not only in armies and decrees, but in the invisible hand that guided the heart through the breath. Even today, this truth endures. A room scented with lavender eases tension. A faint citrus in the air sharpens attention during long hours of talks. Oud in a Middle Eastern hall declares wealth, tradition, continuity. Perfume as a gift tells the visitor, "We want you to remember us, not only with mind, but with breath, with body, with soul." Think of it. A treaty may be broken, a signature forgotten, but the fragrance lingers. A foreign minister returns home, and weeks later, opening his satchel, he catches the faint trace of incense clinging to his clothes. Instantly, the memory returns. The faces, the chamber, the moment of welcome. The scent has carried what paper could not. This is the subconscious power of smell. It slips past arguments, past suspicion, past pride. It lives where trust is born, where fear is soothed, where memory is written deepest. It is why empires burned incense in palaces, why rulers exchanged perfumes as gifts, why envoys were welcomed in scented halls. They were not only shaping the atmosphere, they were shaping memory itself. For diplomacy is never only reason. It is always emotion. And nothing stirs emotion more invisibly, more irresistibly, than fragrance. Thus, across centuries, the pattern holds. From Egypt to China, from India to France, from the Ottoman courts to modern negotiation rooms, scent remains the unseen ambassador. Silent, fleeting, but enduring in memory. And perhaps this is its greatest lesson. That true power is not always loud, not always written in stone. Sometimes it is as subtle as breath, as invisible as smoke, as unforgettable as a fragrance once inhaled, carried forever in the quiet chambers of the mind. The journey has drifted far tonight. From the sands of Egypt to the palaces of Rome, from the incense halls of China to the silken courts of India, from the canals of Venice to the gilded chambers of Versailles. We have followed fragrance across deserts and seas, through temples and treaties, across centuries of intrigue. Always unseen, always fleeting, yet always present. Fragrance has been gift and warning, welcome and threat. It has sealed peace and carried war. It has whispered trust, cloaked betrayal, soothed the weary, unsettled the proud. A trail of smoke rising into air that cannot be held, yet remains in memory. Think of it now. A single stick of incense burns slowly. Its tip glows, its smoke curls upward. Each breath of it is unique, unrepeatable. Soon the ember will die, the smoke will vanish, the fragrance will fade. And yet, when it is gone, you will still remember it. You will carry it, invisible, within you. So it is with power, so it is with history. Kings rise and fall, empires expand and vanish, treaties are signed and forgotten. But the atmosphere they created, the way they shaped breath, the way they touched memory, that remains. Fragrance is the gentlest of teachers. It reminds us that what is unseen can still shape the world. That the smallest gift, a drop of oil, a petal of rose, a splinter of wood, can outlast armies. That diplomacy is not only in words written, but in moments shared, in the simple act of breathing the same air. And now, dear listener, as the night deepens, let this truth rest with you. Fragrance fades, but its memory lingers. Power too often works in silence, shaping what cannot be seen, only felt. The incense grows faint. The ember softens. The smoke thins into nothing. And still, it leaves behind calm. Close your eyes. Breathe gently. The night is here, and you are safe. And as the fragrance drifts away into silence, let the night carry you into rest, into peace, into sleep.